Okay. All right, welcome to the Division of Global Affairs, Spring 2014 Global Affairs Policy Series. Today's guest speaker is our very own Dr. Jean-Marc Quacot, our Director of Global Affairs and Professor of Law and Global Affairs. His lecture topic will be on UN ambiguity towards democracy. So before we begin, a little bit about our own director. Dr. Quacot holds a PhD in political science and law, along with a PhD in philosophy. He has published 14 books, along with more than 60 chapters and articles in the field of comparative politics, political and legal theory, international relations, and international law. His books are available in French, English, Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, and even Arabic. In 2007, he published Beyond the National Interest, The Future of UN Peacekeeping and Multilateralism in the Era of U.S. Primacy. His latest book, co-edited with Daniel Warner, is Ethics and International Affairs, Extent and Limits. Prior to joining Rutgers from 2003 to 2011, he served as the director of the United Nations University at the UN headquarters office here in New York City. From 1996 to 2003, he was the senior academic officer and director of studies at the UNU headquarters in Tokyo. Prior to joining the UN University, from 1992 to 1996, he served as the executive office of the United Nations Secretary General as speechwriter for Dr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali. He's a former fellow at Harvard University from 1986 to 1992 with the Center for International Affairs, the Department of Philosophy, and the Harvard Law School. Dr. Quacot has also held appointments as a cultural attaché with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as a legislative aide with the European Parliament. So let's give him a round of applause before he gets into the book.
Thank you, Kevin. I told you that it wasn't needed, but you insisted. So what can we do? So the topic of today is the ambiguous attitude of the UN towards democracy, and in fact, I mean, this is a presentation that I gave a few weeks ago in an honors program in New Brunswick, and colleagues told me that maybe it would be useful also to have it presented here. So here we are. And so the starting point of the presentation is that more or less 20 years ago, that is to say, towards the end of the Cold War, in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and perhaps better relations among the West, between the West and the non-West, opportunities for democracy and the rule of law emerged, both among nations and within nations. And in a way, in this context, the idea of democracy, the agenda for democracy and for democratization, both within nations and among nations, became more of a possibility than it had been the case before. So that's really the starting point of the presentation, and this starting point really put on the map this notion of democracy in the context of the UN, once again among nations, within nations, more than it had been the case before. And in fact, the gentleman for whom I was working, himself, although coming from a country which is not very much, which wasn't very much a democracy at the time, Egypt, and which is still not very much democracy today, for personal and intellectual reasons, had a strong interest in the issue of democracy among nations, within nations. Himself had been trained as a lawyer and had written extensively on the possibility of a more democratic handling of international relations, among other things in the context of the non-aligned movement back in the 50s, which emerged out of a conference in Bandung in Indonesia. So himself, who had been just appointed Secretary General in 1991, in December 1991, had a strong interest in this notion, ideas, ideals, principles of democracy, which appeared as more of a possibility in the context of the Cold War ending. And so, in this perspective, in the early months of his tenure, in cooperation with member states, Boutros Ghali decided to set up, if you will, a roadmap for his tenure, as well as for the UN and the international community in the early part of the 90s, set up a roadmap based on three issues: peace, development, and democracy. So, in the very early months of 1992, what was supposed to be the first pillar of his intellectual and policy and political roadmap for the UN after the Cold War and for his own tenure as a Secretary General, in a matter of a few months, really, the agenda for peace was prepared, discussed, negotiated among member states, and in the end drafted, so that by the summer of 1992, the matter was settled, and this document would then serve very much as a source of policy in the field of collective security and peacekeeping operations from the early 90s all the way to the late 90s. It's only in the late 90s that, based on the problems encountered in terms of implementing this agenda for peace, on which there was agreement among member states in policy and political terms, in terms of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and conflict prevention. It's only towards the end of the 90s when it appeared that it was quite complicated to really implement this agenda, but this agenda started to stop being really a guideline for collective security and peace maintenance. But very quickly, as I said, a member state came together to really agree on what should be done in the field of collective security, international peace. That was, so once again, it appeared that it was quite easy at the time for member states to conceptualize the possibility of international peace and the possibility of collective security. It was much more complicated when it came to development. So as soon as the agenda for peace was done in the summer of 1992, the international community, member states, the UN Secretariat, key players began to work on the agenda for development. And while when it came to peace, it had been quite easy to agree on what should be done, it was much more complicated when it came for development, because in fact two visions for development emerged, and emerged as being at odds. At least two, the vision coming from developed countries and the vision coming from developing countries. And by the summer of 1994, that is to say 2 years after this exercise of conceptualization and of policy making, if you will, at the global had started, so 2 years after it had started, there was still no agreement among member states about, one, what should be understood by development, two, how should the differences among the different conceptions could be brought together and bridged, and third, what would be the official and publicly sanctioned voice of the UN on development. As a result, while the agenda for peace had led to the publication of an official UN document expressing in fact a formal agreement among member states on the matter, the UN was never able to produce an official document, agenda for development, expressing and formalizing the agreement on the matter among member states. Hence the fact that the best the UN could produce on the matter was simply a working document, in the end a sort of draft. Okay? So that was already the indication that beyond peace, concerning an important aspect of democracy as dovetailed with democratization, it was quite difficult to come up with an agreement. What's happening? Okay. Okay. So things had been a bit difficult for development, and it proved that things would be even more difficult concerning the possibility for member states of coming together on democracy. So by the summer of 1994, much energy had been invested into development. We had to come to the UN had to come to the realization that beyond the professional document, beyond a draft document, nothing was possible, and therefore moved on to the third pillar of the period, democracy. And here, concerning democracy, things became even more complicated to the point that by 1996, when Boutros was asked to leave the UN, in fact, wasn't given a second term, partly because the US and the British vetoed him for a second term. No outcome had been produced regarding democracy, partly because no agreement, no consensus had emerged on, once again, what democracy was about, what should be the ways through which within nations, among nations, democracy and democratic ideals, democratic ideas should be pursued. And therefore, in the end, no true, even provisional document was ever produced. The UN was left there with a number of working documents which never really saw the light of day in a public fashion. And I think that this initial story concerning the fate of thinking on democracy in the early 90s, at a time when, in fact, democracy was put front and center when it comes to the UN agenda, UN ways of thinking globally on the evolution of the world system, is quite indicative of the structural UN ambiguity towards democracy, of the structural and perennial ambiguous relationship of the UN towards democracy. So what I just said earlier is my way to introduce to what is, I think, a perennial situation when it comes to what I call this ambiguity of the UN towards the agenda for democracy, or the agenda of democracy. And how to, if you will, illustrate, to indicate the terms of this ambiguity. I think that the terms of this UN ambiguities towards the UN, towards democracy, can be captured or labeled, if you will, by saying that on the one hand, there is, of course, a strong commitment of the UN to some of the values and principles at the core of democracy, and this within nations as well as among nations. And this is, of course, eminently illustrated by the fact that the UN has, since the middle of the 1940s, a strong commitment to human rights, and the successive human rights treaties which have been adopted throughout the period in the past 60 years are an illustration as well as a demonstration of this commitment that the UN has to core principles and ideas and ideals at the core of democracy. So this is what we have. On one hand, this strong commitment. Yet, on the other hand, this strong UN commitment to democratic values and principles, as eminently illustrated with human rights, has very, very strong limitations. And from a general point of view, from a generic point of view, this tension between the one hand and the other hand is very much an indication of the overall ambiguity that the UN has towards democracy, overall ambiguity, which I think one of the key features of the UN as an international global organization. Okay, and so so when it comes to being more specific about this tension, this kind of paradox on the one hand, on the other hand, I think that there are three ways to illustrate the modalities of this tension, the modalities of this ambiguity, right? So one way to go about this is to really tackle the matter, tackle this ambiguity via the institutional route, if you will. The second way has to do with norms and principles and values, and the third one is in fact what happens on the ground in terms of operational commitment or not of the UN to democratic or semi-democratic or democratic-related principles, values, and norms. So this is my way to introduce to my second point, that is to say, you know, let us see how this ambiguity of the UN towards democracy or democratic ideals is at work at these three levels, which are of course some of the key levels of how international organizations, and more specifically the UN, unfold both in terms of their foundations, in terms of their horizon, but also in terms of their day-to-day modes of operation. So when it comes to the ambiguity unfolding from an institutional point of view, I think, and once again, you know, this is not pretending to be comprehensive and systematic, just, you know, a way to think about these things so that we can discuss afterward. So when it comes to the institutional illustration of this ambiguity, I think that there are four ways to try to capture this ambiguity. And these four ways have to do with the UN Charter. They have to do with how membership is conceptualized and is taking place in the context of the UN. The third one has to do with the nature of the General Assembly and of the Security Council and of their relationships. And the fourth one has to do also, in a related fashion, with the exclusivity of the Security Council. So, if you don't mind, and you don't have a choice, let's go point by point and let's see how each of these 4 points can be used as an illustration of this ambiguous relationship of the UN towards democracy. Well, I mean, and once again, none of this is rocket science, it's quite straightforward, it's quite simple, and I'm sure that you know all these things. So, what about the UN as an indication, as an illustration of this ambiguity towards democracy and democratic ideals? Well, very simply, you know, while the UN Charter starts with the people, famously, the bottom line is that in the end, the UN is an intergovernmental organization. So the primary beneficiaries, if you will, of the UN are meant to be the people, but the primary members of the UN are governments. And even though in a democratic setup, governments are meant to be the expressions and the servants, if you will, of the people, we all know that even in a democratic setting, there is a lot of lack of transparency and a lack of direct relationship between governments and people. So already, when it comes to the Charter, even though the Charter starts with the people, in the end, once it has stated with the people, the rest of the document is all about how government are going to be operationalizing, if you will, how governments are going to be, and states are going to be the primary actors of the UN. So right away you have this tension here, okay? And of course this tension then unfolds in many, many ways throughout the life and actions and policies of the UN, and it has been the case in the past 60 years, okay? So, second institutional indication of this ambiguous commitment of the UN to democracy is simply the nature of membership when it comes to the UN. The bottom line here is that while, partly because the UN has this commitment to democratic values, democracy is preferred, in the end, democracy as the qualitative nature of a given state is not required. And of course, this was envisioned in the 1940s as a way to have the UN as embracing as universal as possible, and as a way to avoid very few people within and a lot of people outside the UN. So in a way, there was the vision that if we're not going to be very demanding in terms of the qualitative nature of the nations, governments, and so on, for the member states, then we would be more inclusive, and therefore this would give relevance and stability to the UN, but in the process, what had to be given up was this idea that even though democracy is preferred, it's certainly not required. And the fact that today, out of 193 member states, explicit democracies are really very small minorities in the UN, and of course, among this explicit minority of democracies, very few democratic regimes are really true to the democratic values they claim they are abiding by. Okay? So second illustration from an institutional point of view. Then the third institutional illustration of this ambiguity is the nature of two of the defining bodies of the UN, the General Assembly and the Security Council. As you know, the General Assembly is a universal body with each country having a voice or a seat. So it fulfills, if you will, the requirement of universality, which is one of the requirements of democratic ideals and democratic ideas. But when it comes to the General Assembly, it comes with hardly no power at all. So it's really very much a superfluous body in terms of real power. Its power is largely symbolic. It doesn't even have, as an assembly, a legislative power. On the other hand, you have the Security Council with 2 layers of membership, the 5 permanent members, and then 10 non-permanent members. And of course, the 5 permanent members are themselves the beneficiaries of the immediate aftermath of World War II, and themselves, first of all, self-selected themselves, which is not very democratic, and today do not represent the state of the world as it has changed in the past 60 years. So in the end, you have this. So and of course, the relationship is deeply unequal when it comes to the GA, the General Assembly and the Security Council, because once again, the General Assembly has hardly any power, while the Security Council has a lot of power. So you have the nature of these two bodies, and then the nature of the relationship, which in the end leads to this kind of description: universality of the General Assembly with symbolic power versus the select few of the Council with, in fact, executive power. Executive power which is not even constrained by what we would call, in a democratic domestic setting, control of constitutionality. The fact of the matter is that the Security Council has more or less total freedom based on interpreting and twisting the Charter, has almost total freedom in terms of adopting resolutions which are going to have the effect of becoming international law, of changing international law. And the 90s in this context have been very much an illustration of this state of affairs. So you have a very few number of countries enjoying executive power, which is not even controlled by a sense of control of constitutionality. Okay? So this is what we can